All right, let's jump right in. We're going to tackle a really critical question today. In a world where disasters just keep getting more and more complex, why do our emergency plans so often, well, fall short? We're going to dig into why that old playbook isn't cutting it anymore, and what a newer, much more adaptive approach might look like.
And this quote, man, it just nails it, doesn't it? It perfectly captures that sinking, stomach drop moment for any planner. You know the one. It's when the hurricane decides to take a sharp right turn, or all the evacuation routes just completely lock up in ways no simulation could ever see coming. It's that exact moment when your beautiful, carefully managed order just unravels into total, unpredictable chaos.
And that leads us to the absolute core question we're asking here. What if these aren't just failures of planning? What if the problem is our entire way of thinking, our whole paradigm? What if we need a completely different way of looking at disasters? That's the big idea we're going to unpack today.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this new approach, we've got to first figure out what's broken with the old one. This is where that traditional playbook really starts to come apart at the seams.
You see, for decades, emergency management has basically used an old-school industrial age model. It treats a disaster like it's a complicated machine. You know, if we can just map out all the parts, write a super detailed plan, and control every little piece of the response, we can fix it. But the complexity view, it offers a totally different, kind of radical alternative. It asks, what if a disaster isn't like a machine at all? What if it's more like a living ecosystem, something that's dynamic, interconnected, and, at its core, completely unpredictable?
And the failure of that old model? It was just laid bare for everyone to see at Fukushima. The engineers, they had a plan for an earthquake. Yep. They also had a plan for a tsunami. Check. But what they didn't have was a plan for the two of them hitting at the same time. They totally missed the interaction between the two events. And the result? It was this horrifying cascade of failures, where one system breakdown just triggered the next, and the next, in a feedback loop that no single expert, no matter how brilliant, could have predicted.
And this brings us to a really crucial point. The very nature of emergencies has changed. We're not just dealing with complicated events anymore. We're dealing with a whole new kind of problem.
Now, the fancy term for this is a complex adaptive system. I know, it sounds super academic, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. Just think about a city's power grid, or even the flow of traffic during an emergency evacuation. The system as a whole behaves in ways you could never ever guess just by looking at one car or one power line. There's a kind of hidden order to it, but there's no single person at the top pulling all the strings.
And a huge feature of these systems is how deeply interconnected everything is. I mean, our modern world is just this massive web of dependencies, right? You've got power grids, communication networks, supply chains, all linked together. And what that means is that one tiny little failure in one small corner of that web can trigger a gigantic, system-wide collapse. Let's look at a classic example of this in action. The 2003 Northeast blackout. You won't believe how it started. It kicked off with two things that seemed totally minor and local: a software bug and some overgrown trees in Ohio. That's it. But because the power grid was so tightly interconnected, those two little triggers just cascaded and led to a massive, widespread shutdown.
And the final result of that little bug and those trees? 50 million people plunged into darkness. Just let that number sink in for a second. It is such a stark reminder of how, in a complex system, the most seemingly trivial little things can have these enormous, just wildly disproportionate consequences.
Okay, the next key idea here is something called emergence, and this one really clashes with that traditional top-down command and control way of thinking. All it really means is that order can bubble up from the bottom, without a central plan or a boss giving orders. It's what happens when a bunch of people, just responding to what's happening around them, create these really effective patterns of behavior that nobody actually designed.
And the Cajun Navy is just the perfect and honestly totally heroic example of this. During Hurricane Harvey, you had these ordinary folks with their own boats. They didn't sit around waiting for official orders. No way. They jumped on social media, they self-organized, and they created this incredibly effective rescue fleet that saved countless lives, all while operating completely outside of any formal command structure. Now, that wasn't chaos. That was a different and very powerful kind of order.
Okay, so if disasters are this complex, and these amazing bottom-up solutions can just emerge, how on earth are we supposed to manage them? I mean, we can't just throw all our plans out the window, right? What we need is a new tool, a new way of seeing the problem that helps us actually make sense of all the chaos.
And that tool is called the Cynefin framework.
Now, this isn't about neatly putting problems into boxes. Think of it more as a sense-making tool for leaders who are in the thick of it, in the fog of a crisis. Its whole job is to help you figure out what kind of problem you're dealing with right now so you can use the right kind of solution. So here's a quick look at how it works. On the left side of the chart, you've got situations that are pretty stable. In the simple or clear domain, it's obvious what to do. Think about filing a standard damage report. You just follow the checklist. Easy. Then you have the complicated domain. This is where you need experts. Say, restoring a downed cell tower. There are known solutions, but it takes a specialist. Now, on the right side, things get unstable. This is where most big disasters live. In the complex domain, you just can't predict what's going to happen next. Imagine trying to manage a citywide evacuation during a flood. The only way to move forward is to carefully probe, try a small action, sense how the system reacts, and then respond and adapt. And finally, you got the chaotic domain. This is the house on fire crisis, a building collapse. Your first job isn't to plan, it's to act. Do anything to create some stability.
So here's the absolute heart of the problem, right? We keep treating these complex disasters as if they're just complicated. We throw more experts at them, we write thicker and thicker plans, but as this quote says so perfectly, that's like trying to control a flock of birds by shouting orders at each individual sparrow. It's never going to work. You can't command the parts. You have to find a way to influence the overall pattern.
So if you can't command the individual sparrows, how in the world do you influence the flock? Well, it requires a pretty fundamental shift in how we organize ourselves, moving away from rigid top-down hierarchies and toward more flexible networks.
Now, let me be really clear. This isn't about throwing out traditional hierarchies altogether. They're actually really good for certain things, like managing resources or making sure someone is accountable. But when you're in the middle of a complex crisis, networks are just way better at sharing information fast and adapting on the fly. So the real solution isn't choosing one over the other. It's about knowing when and how to leverage both.
You can actually see this in the research from the 9/11 response. It's fascinating. The agencies that coordinated the best on that day weren't the ones just following some rigid command chart. Nope. They were the groups where people already knew and trusted each other from doing joint training exercises together. It was those pre-existing informal networks that allowed them to adapt and coordinate way faster than any formal command ever could.
So really, what this all points to is a really profound shift in our entire mindset. We have to move away from this obsession with creating the perfect, predictive plan that's supposed to control a disaster. That's a fool's errand. The new goal is to build systems, to build communities that have the built-in capacity to adapt, to improvise, and to bounce back from the surprises that we know are inevitably coming.
So what does this new playbook actually look like in practice? Well, first off, plans become flexible frameworks. Think of them as general guidance and priorities, not these rigid step-by-step scripts that are just going to break the second they hit reality. Second, training changes. The focus shifts from just drilling procedures to recognizing patterns. You teach responders to ask, okay, what kind of problem am I in? Is this simple, complicated, or complex? So they can use the right approach. Third, our exercises need to become more like labs for exploring how the whole system behaves under stress, not just a test to see if everyone followed the plan. And finally, and this one is so important, we have to empower decision-making on the ground. We have to trust the people with the best local knowledge to act, without them having to wait for permission from some distant HQ.
So, this brings us to the big takeaway here. In a world that's only getting more interconnected, more unpredictable, this isn't just some interesting academic theory. This is an absolute imperative.
All right, so let's just quickly recap the key takeaways from all this. First, remember that emergencies are complex, not just complicated. That means that, yes, small events can have massive consequences. But it also means that the amazing self-organization we see, like the Cajun Navy, that's a feature, not a bug. It's a strength we should be harnessing, not trying to control. And the bottom line? Building our ability to adapt is so much more important than trying to perfectly predict the future.
And all of this leaves us with one final and, I think, really critical question. We know for a fact that the future is going to bring surprises. That's pretty much the only thing we can truly predict. So the question is, are we going to build systems that can actually adapt to that surprise? Or are we just going to be left standing in the rubble, shaking our heads, and insisting that the old playbook should have worked? The choice really is ours. Thanks for joining me.